Okay, hey you guys, it's Amelia Newcomb here. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I wanted to talk to you guys today about saddle fit, and just as a forewarning, I'm not like a certified saddle fitter or anything like that, so definitely you should have someone that's certified and that really knows what they're doing come and properly fit your horses. But there's a lot that you can do to kind of just start to train your eye, and we all kind of know enough, like just by looking at a saddle you can tell if it generally fits or doesn't fit. And so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about that today. Okay, so this is Kensington. He's 5. I just got him and he is our first patient today. So I'm going to have the camera person come over here. We're going to take a look at his back. And I kind of always first just look at their backs and kind of assess the general shape of their back. So if we look at his back, which maybe we can do. So because he's young, he doesn't have a ton of muscle over his back. You can kind of see his spine, and he's resting his right hind leg. So let me try and get him to stand square. So you can see that his spine kind of protrudes out, and he also has a fairly prominent and big withers that sticks out. So this is important because you don't want the saddle to be pushing on these big withers, nor do you want the saddle to be anywhere laying on his spine. Also, with a young horse like this, over the next few years, all of this should fill in with muscle. So sometimes, like with him, I'm not going to right away go out and buy him a custom made saddle because he's going to change a lot. So I'd rather find a saddle that kind of generally fits him, and then in a year or two I'll get him a saddle that's actually his saddle. So let me show you. I'm going to grab really quick the saddle I've been using on him. Okay, so this is a custom saddle, which in general, these are my favorite saddles to ride in. This is a saddle that I kind of generally use on all my young horses. So when I put a saddle on a horse and I'm kind of looking for whether or not it's going to fit him, the first thing that I kind of just look at in general is I kind of look and see just if it generally fits his body shape. So you shouldn't see like big gaps. You also want to try to look underneath the saddle here and check for bridging. So a bridge saddle is when there'll be pressure in the back and pressure in the front, and then if you look underneath of the saddle like here, you can see daylight under the middle, and that's not a good thing. So that's kind of one of the things. Now the second thing I look for is the balance. So you want to see that the middle of the saddle, you can see in this saddle there's a crease where my seat bones go. So that's kind of the balance point of the saddle. And you don't want to see that the saddle, like you could see if the saddle were like this, it would put the rider's weight too far back on the horse's low back. Nor do you want to see that the saddle would be like this, because that's going to put too much the weight on the shoulder. So then I also kind of check when I put a saddle on that it doesn't rock. So I just kind of put my hand on the front and the back, and this saddle rocks a little bit on him. This isn't the most ideal fit saddle. And like, to me, I think that it sits a little bit low in front. Like, I'd like to see it maybe just a little more like this. You can see how then that puts, like right now when it's just sitting alone, it looks like it might be a little light behind here and a little low in front. But that also can change when you put the girth on and cinch it down. So because this saddle isn't ideal for him, I put a fleece pad under, which I'm going to grab really quick. Okay, so I really like to use these Mattis fleece pads, and studies have shown that the sheepskin underneath just helps spread out the force. So if there's any like places under your saddle where there's a lot more pressure, this fleece is going to help just equalize that. So let me put this under the saddle for you, and you can see when I put this under the saddle how it right away kind of just looks a little bit more comfortable on his back and more suitable for him. So you can see with the fleece pad how it helped a little bit lift up the front, and like I said, the sheepskin will just help equalize all the pressure underneath the saddle for him. So let me show you now a saddle that clearly doesn't fit him. Okay, so this is a Kiefer saddle, which is I actually really like this saddle. It's a very different type of saddle. So we're gonna put this on his back, see what it looks like. Try to get him to stand square. If you can get your horse to stand square, it's helpful, but he really is not cooperating. So you can see right away this saddle, how it, like if I put my hand and move it on him, see how much it moves compared to the other one. So right away, like I said, I'm not a certified saddle fitter, but I can just tell by looking at this saddle and kind of seeing how it moves that it's really not stable on his back. And that's going to be a big problem, especially since he's a big moving horse. If the saddle's sliding all around, obviously I'll have a girth on it, but you don't want to have to make the girth like extremely tight. So this would not be a saddle that I would ride him in. I also it actually has quite a bit of space, but I always like to stick my hand in the front here and make sure that I can put a few fingers between their withers and the top of this saddle. I've had, if your saddle is too wide, it will actually sit down on the horse's withers, and that can be super uncomfortable and painful for them. So, okay, so let's look at Natasha now. Natasha, you're the supermodel. Move over, move over. Okay, so this is Natasha, and Natasha is an older horse. She is 13, I believe, and she does the Grand Prix. So she's a bit more developed in her back and in her shoulders than Kensington is, because obviously she's older. And she has, you know, a prominent wither, but it's not as high as Kensington. But you can see like she has a bit more muscle through her back and also in here through her shoulders than Kensington does. So let's put her saddle on her first. So this is her saddle that has been made and fitted to her. And as you can see, you know, when we look at the balance, you can see that the deepest part of the saddle, which again I have starting to get a little seat bone mark in there, is where it should be. You can see that the saddle is in good balance. It doesn't look like it would be putting the rider too far forward or too far back. You could see that it kind of lends itself to me sitting upright on her. Again, if I look underneath, I don't see any daylight right through here, so the saddle is not bridging on her, which is a good thing. And then the other thing that I look for is I kind of look from behind. Can you see? Yeah. Okay, so if you look from behind, you want to see that the saddle is straight, so that the middle of the saddle and the gullet here is sitting right in the middle of her spine. Thanks, Natasha. And it looks pretty good here, actually. Maybe a little off to the left, but again, it's hard because it's not like it's girthed up or anything. So that's pretty good. Okay, let's try on her another saddle. Let's try Kensington saddle on her and see what that looks like. Hey, don't kill the camera lady. Okay, so this saddle is the one that I've been riding, Kensington, and again, I mean, it doesn't look bad, but you can see that it's not quite as stable as her saddle is. Like if I go like this, you can see how it's rocking more than her saddle, and it just doesn't look like it fits like a glove. You know, it should be like you know how it is when you put on a pair of jeans that just fit your body versus if you put on a pair of jeans that clearly doesn't. So that's kind of just to give you a different example. Okay, so now I wanted to talk to you guys about shimming. And shimming is something that you can do to help correct a saddle instead of reflocking the saddle. So all these saddles have wool flocking underneath, like, let me show you. So if you look underneath the saddle in these panels, you can stuff wool into them. And that's called the flocking of the saddle. You need to have your saddle reflocked because over time the wool compresses and it gets really hard, and there should be some give so that the saddle acts as a shock absorber. Your saddle fitter can also adjust this to help correctly fit the saddle. So if the saddle needs to come up a little in front, they can put more flocking here. If the saddle needs to go down a little behind, they can add a little less back here. Now, some horses, actually all horses, are crooked, and they have like uneven muscle development, which can cause the saddle to go either left or right. And there's debate about whether or not you should flock the saddle like differently left and right to get the saddle to fit. In my opinion, I think that it's better to leave the saddle, like to flock the saddle evenly and then shim it to get the saddle to fit straight. And then over time, if you correctly ride and train your horse, they should get straighter and more even in their muscling to where you don't need the flocking. So that's kind of my theory. So I'm going to show you how to flock a saddle, or how to shim a saddle. So these are shim pads, and if you get something like this is a Mattis pad. I'll link where you guys can get these below, but this pad has 4 little compartments in here where you can put the shim pads. And what the shims do is they kind of stabilize the saddle and can shift the saddle either up in front or up behind, or also if your saddle goes to the left or to the right, you can fix that with a shim pad. So I'm going to just show you, for example, with this saddle, if we wanted to lift the front of the saddle, like if you felt like your saddle was, which this really isn't, but if you felt like your saddle was too up in the back and you wanted to a little bit lift the front, you could put these shims. You can either put it in that pad like I had, or you can just simply put the shims underneath of the saddle like this to get the saddle to sit a little bit higher in front. So you can see how that changed the balance of the saddle. There's a little more space up here, and the front of the saddle is a little higher than it was without the shim pads. Okay, so let's say that, let's go to the back of her again. So I would say if people have a problem, most horses, on most horses, the saddle wants to sit to the left. And part of this is because the horse's right shoulders generally aren't as developed as the left shoulders. So if your saddle wants to go off to the left, the way that you're going to shim that is you're going to put a shim under the right front, under the right shoulder of the saddle, because that's going to pull the saddle a little to the right. And then you're going to put another shim under the left rear of the saddle, like that. So that diagonal pair of left rear and right front is going to bring your saddle more over to the right. If your saddle wants to fall to the left, you're going to do the opposite. So if your saddle wants to go to the left, you're going to shim the left front and the right rear, like that. Okay, so if you don't have these shim pads, here, video over here. If you don't have these shim pads, something that works really great is you can just use a yoga mat and cut a yoga mat up, and then that will, you can use that instead of this. They work really well because they're kind of sticky like this, and you can just put those underneath your saddle and kind of play around with shimming your saddle and see if that helps you.
I'm Kane. I'm Amelia's assistant. I'm mostly a jumper rider, but I do ride dressage as well. And especially for our jumping saddles, when we fit them, we really want the angle of the saddle to fit the angle of the horse because they each have different shoulders. For my horse, she needs a little bit more of a forward flap, but that also works for me because I have short legs, and jumping a little bit higher, you want your legs a little bit higher up. So it matters a lot of how you're going to be riding your horse and how you fit your horse. For the dressage saddles, they don't come forward onto their shoulder, they sit right behind it. So I feel it's really important that this angle keeps their freedom of movement in their shoulder.
Perfect.
So for this saddle, the angle really cuts off her shoulder back here. It has the freedom here, but a rider with a leg that fits this is going to want something a little bit different for their horse. The angle of the saddle does not fit the angle of her shoulder, especially down here if you see the curve that it takes on this muscle.
You find the lowest part of the saddle because it'll roll to it.
And what does that tell you? Then what do you do?
Well, you want that to be the same. So if it rolls there, right, then it's obviously, you can see it too, but where it rolls to the center, or to the lowest point, I mean. So then you know, like if the pen ends up here, the saddle's too high in the front, other than just looking at it with your eye, you know, because it'll roll to the lowest point. And where do you want the lowest point of the saddle?
Like right above where your leg should hang in the stirrups.
Right, so this would be, you know, you'd want that to be a little more forward. I mean, I realize everything else, but you know, you want that to be not back there. So just a little fine-tuning thing.
Thanks, Sonny. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys a horse that is much wider in the back than either Kensington or Natasha. So if you look at Claire's back here, you can see that her withers are much less prominent, and she has much, like if you just put the palm of your hand here, it's much flatter and wider across her spine and also through her withers and her shoulder area. So you can tell that she would need a very, like a wider saddle than Kensington, who's much narrower. So I'm going to show you quick her saddle before it starts pouring. So this is Claire's saddle, and you can see, like when you put it on her, it kind of fits like a glove. It has a tiny bit of rock to it, but given how round she is, a horse that's really round and doesn't have a prominent wither, it's hard to get a saddle that doesn't slip at all to the side. So this is a pretty good fit for her. Let's put Kensington's saddle on her quick. Okay, so this, you can tell this saddle sits a little low in front, but actually not too bad. But again, if we look at that shoulder angle, it doesn't quite match her shoulder angle. Okay, it's raining too much. The end.